Hey ladies and gentlemen, Richard Core Kenobi here, and I'm back again for another Versus Series reaction, and today we have Antoine Bandelari's new Versus matchup, or should I say Versus crossover matchup, Rick and Carl from The Walking Dead, the TV show, versus Ellie and Joel from The Last of Us. And oh boy, this is a great matchup. And now for those of you who do not know, I am a huge fan of the Force cast. I love their Versus series, but mainly I love Evan Nova 95, Antoine Bandelari, and Jen Sarai. But I do love Ready For. His Versus series is pretty good too. But mainly there's something about Antoine that stands out, to me at least, but I still love Evan, is that he doesn't just do Star Wars Versus series, he does other Versus series. He does crossover Versus series, so he'll do Star Wars Versus series, Avatar, Harry Potter, Mass Effect, Kingdom Hearts, Walking Dead now, The Last of Us, so many more, but also too what he'll do, oh, and Legend of Korra, duh, he'll cross these two over, like one of his crossover fights, Darth Vader versus Voldemort, yes, he did that one. So if you want to see interesting crossover battles, I highly suggest you go check out his channel, Antoine Bandelari, again. Now, this fight in particular, this came from a user on one of his videos called Lamar Rice, who suggested this fight, and Antoine loved it, and he said he might do it. So yeah, that's crazy. So in other words, man, I mean, this is going to be a good fight. Now, I am a fan of The Walking Dead. I have seen all 5 seasons. I have seen somewhat of season 6, because I was not a fan of the cliffhanger. Sorry. And I have played The Last of Us, and I do love Joel and Ellie so much. And by the way, Ellie is voiced by Tara from Teen Titans. Yeah, the original one. Not that other one! Sorry. So yes. Now, in terms of who I think is gonna win, oh my god. As much as I love Rick, I am a huge... Now, if you were to ask me, who do I like more, Rick or Daryl? I'm a Rick fan all day. I love Rick. I don't know why. I love his character. But I have to go with Joel and Ellie. Mainly for reasons that I think Antoine is probably going to explain in his video. So, yeah. But other than that, let's watch this fight. Here we go.
Armageddon, the Apocalypse, The Walking Dead, The Last of Us. When the world is tormented by disease and infection, what is left of humanity? In a society ruled by the survival of the fittest, who are its survivors, and what is left over?
Because this is how we survive. We tell ourselves that we are the Walking Dead.
Roll credits.
2 of these survivors were Rick and Carl Grimes, father and son, surviving in a world of reanimated human corpses. For 2 years, though, let's be honest, judging by Carl's age, it should be more like 5 years. They have been battling through the dead and the living, coping with their humanity and their lack of it. But through the odds, they persevered through the outbreak, the herds, but most of all, themselves, and some other humans.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
Joel and Ellie, unrelated by blood, but bonded by a similar task, finding a cure for the infection that has plagued their world for more than 20 years. An infection that turned its host from a relatively sensible human into a raging monster, evolving into what they called runners, clickers, and bloaters. Despite these dire disadvantages, together, the old man and the young girl braved their dying world. But at the end of their journey, though they survived, their ultimate salvation remained in question. For this video, I'll be examining Rick and Carl solely from the Walking Dead television series, up until season 6. As a special caveat, this will be Carl before he was shot through one eye. For Joel and Ellie, I will be observing them during the events of The Last of Us and Left Behind video games.
Okay.
Rick Grimes is a middle-aged man, somewhere in his 40s. Before the outbreak, he was a sheriff at King County, and considering his profession, he was rather fit. It's typical for most police officers to pass physical conditioning tests, such as short-distance sprints and marathon running, for when they pursue suspects, and typical muscle-building exercises to increase their strength when tussling with criminals. Not to mention, many police officers take on a martial skill, such as boxing or mixed martial arts. But of course, all of this conditioning would be enhanced once Rick found out that the world was overrun by walkers. Things like his cardio and his strength would have increased tenfold, taking on hordes of walkers and other equally physical humans. Carl Grimes, as of season 6, is supposed to be around 14 years of age. He's definitely come a long way since season 1, going through a notable growth spurt, but I do question him as a physical opponent. Much like his father, his conditioning would have increased, but he definitely saw less action.
Yeah.
And while there were times where the kid was pretty badass, there were also moments like this.
Wow. Yeah. Oh.
So it makes a guy wonder. But to be fair, he is regarded as a valuable part of the group, taking on his fair share of the undead. It's also worth mentioning that Carl got one of his eyes shot out, but so far it hasn't been a detriment to him in any way, and he made a full recovery. Still, this analysis will be looking at Carl before he went blind in one eye.
Got it.
Like Rick, Joel was a middle-aged man, somewhere in his 40s, most likely his late 40s. Before the outbreak, he worked in construction of some sort. Definitely not as good as being a police officer, but generally speaking, construction was hard work, and it built up quite a bit of strength.
Yeah.
But all of that will be inconsequential once his world got turned upside down. For 20 years, he battled those infected by the cordyceps virus, or those who simply looked at him the wrong way.
Just give me a couple
What's most impressive is that the infected of his world were notably more ferocious than the zombies in The Walking Dead. And while he could not take on a clicker or a bloater without getting his throat ripped out or his face smashed in, he did stand up to the raging runners.
Right.
It's also worth mentioning that Joel was a smuggler, dealing with other humans who meant to do him harm on a regular basis. And when facing these humans, Joel often held his own, even while being a much older man against younger opponents.
Yeah.
Man, you hit hard. Well, I was trying to kill you.
Like Carl, Ellie was 14 years old, but unlike Carl, she was born into the infected world, never knowing the way it was before. Ellie was a restless kid, transferred between many military schools within different quarantine zones. These military schools were designed to prepare the next generation for the new world they lived in. Typically at the end of the program, these children joined the United Armed Forces, who were set up to protect the safe zones. Ellie's training, along with her experience crossing the country with Joel, would go a long way. She stood no chance against clickers and bloaters, and even against runners, she could not match them blow for blow, instead using stealth or her knife to take them out.
Right.
We should also take note of the aspects of the listening mode in The Last of Us. Both Joe and Ellie, in the single-player game, can essentially hear through walls, picking up a visual outline of their enemies. For me, this is largely a game mechanic. One could argue that the game mechanic translates into Joel and Ellie having a heightened awareness.
True.
Yet, it's something everyone can do, including the multiplayer characters, which dampens the unique quality of it. And in the grounded play mode, listen mode is taken away entirely, for more realism.
Right. That's true.
That all said, I do favor Joel and Ellie overall in their physicality. Though I think Rick would take a slight edge over Joel in terms of training and skill.
Yeah.
Pound for pound, I favor Joel, based on Joel's more brutal assaults against runners, who are a fair bit more challenging than a slow-moving walker.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like Rick had a glass jaw. Every time Carl seems like he's becoming a badass, he does something like this,
Yeah.
while Ellie does something like this.
Ooh. Yeah.
It's very marginal. I see Joel and Rick as relatively on par, but I favor Ellie over Carl. Joel and Ellie get the slight collective edge for their physical abilities.
Okie dokie.
For this round, and for this matchup, I will be allowing each character a primary weapon, a sidearm, and a melee weapon. For their rifles and pistols, in the vein of both series, and the scarcity of ammo, they will only be allowed one magazine of ammo for each weapon. No
Okay.
reload. For Rick, I will be examining him with an AK-47, his signature Colt Python, and a knife. Of course he has used other weapons like the M4 carbine, but during his travels between the prison and Alexandria, he got a lot of use out of the AK-47. The choice of his Colt Python is a no-brainer, and like everyone else in the group, Rick carried a knife on him at all times. For Carl, I will be examining him with his Remington 700, his Beretta 92 FS, and his standard knife.
Okay.
Carl has used quite a few rifles, but he usually played a support role, so I felt a bolt-action rifle would be the best choice. Much like his father, his Beretta was an easy pick, as he used it very often. And in terms of a melee weapon, Carl, like many of the other children in the group, learned to use knives and carry them on their person at all times. For Joel, I will be examining him with an assault rifle, a 9mm pistol, and a few shivs.
Gotcha.
In the context of fairness, Joel will get an assault rifle to balance Rick's AK-47. In the video game, the first weapon Joel carries on him for his smuggling jobs is a standard 9mm pistol, so that choice seems valid.
Right.
And of course, Joel was an expert at making shivs, even on the fly. For Ellie, I will be examining her with a bolt-action rifle, a Beretta Model 70, and her switchblade.
Gotcha.
I debated between Ellie using a rifle or her bow, but again, to keep it somewhat balanced, I decided to go with the rifle, which would be more efficient in a firefight. Alright, so we got all the weapons out of the way, so it's time to examine how each character used their weapons and how skilled they were with them. In terms of rifles, I would say they were all relatively on par. Much of Rick's police training included shotguns and pistols, but he did handle his AK-47 very well. Joel doesn't acquire his assault rifle until the very end of the game, and in the context of the world, I would say he didn't use them very often. These types of weapons seem to be relegated to the military, which is why a smuggler like himself carried weapons that were more easily concealed. Still, he did tear through an entire hospital of the military, so there is that. Carl and Ellie seem to have the same amount of skill with rifles, though one can argue that Carl has a bit more experience than Ellie, considering his experience defending the prison in Alexandria, while Ellie only had a few months with her rifle at best. Some differences start arising with their sidearms. For this, I would definitely side with Rick and his Colt Python over Joel and his 9mm. Joel wasn't a bad shot by any means, but Rick's headshot count with his signature weapon was sort of insane. Plus, he's very familiar with the weapon, using it well before the outbreak. Again, Carl and Ellie are pretty much equal, though I might tip the favor to Carl, who also pulled off headshots like nothing. Granted, these headshots were against slow-moving targets rather than humans, or fast-moving runners or stalkers. But it should be noted that the zombies in Carl's world could only be killed by headshots, whereas in The Last of Us, a simple shot to the chest or leg or any other vital organ could generally stop a runner or a stalker. In terms of their melee weapons, I think this comes down to their physical abilities, as described in the previous round. But there is an argument that Rick and Carl have more experience using their knives, as that was the best way to end walkers indefinitely. That's not to say that Joel and Ellie weren't efficient with their shivs and knives, especially with regards to Ellie, who used her knife consistently to get out of tight corners.
Right.
Ultimately, in terms of their weapons and skill, I think I would favor Rick and Carl. Both teams are relatively on par, but there are some micro advantages to the father-son duo, such as Rick's training and familiarity with his weapons, and their collective, consistent use of melee weapons on a day-to-day. For this, I would give the slight edge to Rick and Carl for their weaponry and skill.
Alright. Round 3, tactical and teamwork.
Teamwork is an absolute necessity in The Walking Dead and The Last of Us.
Yes.
Yes, other men and women became the most dangerous foes in the world, but their kinship became all the more important as well. One may say that Rick and Carl obviously have a leg up in terms of their father-son relationship, bonded by blood.
True.
But they've had their fair share of animosity as well.
But now, you're nothing.
That being the case, they still logged more time together than Joel and Ellie, who knew each other for less than a year. But that's all speaking in general terms. What really should be examined here is how these teams worked off each other in active combat.
Okay.
There aren't too many examples of Rick and Carl fighting together, but there are a few times the group fought in unison, clearing out walkers or defending against humans. After their first winter, the group was in perfect sync, methodical in their clearing tactics. In looking at the group's tactics, we may be able to apply that to Rick and Carl's synergy, assuming they can work in concert without much issue. The 2 times we did see them fight together, they did rather well against walkers, but it may be a different case against humans, like Joel and Ellie. The pseudo-father-daughter pair were quite resourceful and very cohesive as a combative team. Typically Ellie ran distraction while Joel flanked, or vice versa. But they could also fight head-up if need be. Most of all, they were both ingenious crafters, building makeshift weapons on the fly, like Molotovs, smoke bombs, proximity bombs, and melee upgrades. Granted, we should take the video game logic into account.
Okay.
In-game, it takes less than a second to craft any one item, but in reality, producing a smoke bomb would take much longer than that.
Right.
Still, it is a great feat of ingenuity on Joel and Ellie's part, and Ellie in particular, who was always looking for the upper hand, always keeping her focus, freeing herself from Bill's piping, and finding the best opportunity to escape David when she could. Rick and Carl have definitely had time fighting with one another, but they didn't have the same experience fighting other men and women together, only walkers. Joel and Ellie, by contrast, had experience fighting the much more frightening infected, along with human adversaries. Plus, they were extremely crafty when need be, whether it was their flanking teamwork, or the weapons they could make on the fly. In the same situations, Rick and Carl would likely hold their own, but it was usually Daryl or Michonne that met human opposition with Rick, not Carl. So looking purely at what we have, Joel and Ellie are more favorable. Joel and Ellie get the edge for their tactics and their teamwork.
Okay. Here we go.
Rick, Carl, Joel, and Ellie, all survivors of their zombie-infested worlds, though neither group referred to them as such.
No.
The walkers.
Not many geeks get through.
Those things out there.
Infected lurkers.
Docile. Or lurkers, whatever you like.
But if they met and knew they had to end the other, which team would come out on top? Which pair would be the ultimate survivors?
Okay.
Let's set up this fight. Let's say it takes place in the Willamette Parkview Mall from Dead Rising. The following is a hypothetical explanation of these outcomes. First, let's examine the early fight. Let's say they're in the courtyard of the mall. Carl and Ellie perch with their rifles as Rick and Joel try to press up a flank. As a reminder, all characters will only have 1 round of ammo for each of their weapons. Much of this early fight will revolve around their skill with their weapons. Who is more likely to land a shot? As previously described, I think this advantage would fall to Rick and Carl. Either Carl lands a shot on Ellie, or Rick on Joel. Then the matchup would move on to a 2 versus 1, where the remainder of the opposing team would have to be dealt with, giving Rick and Carl a 2-to-1 advantage in the early fight.
Alright.
However, with such scarce ammo, this isn't a sure thing. While I do believe Joel and Ellie aren't as collectively good with their firearms, they would not be easy targets.
No.
And as such, the fight would continue into the mid-range bout. This would likely come by way of ammo depletion, everyone using a full magazine of their assault rifles, or all the ammo for their bolt shots. Switching to their sidearms, the fight would get closer in proximity. Much of the mid-fight would be based around positioning and communication. And in this, Joel and Ellie would have a leg up, employing such tactics on a daily basis. Rick and Carl would definitely have synergy, but Joel and Ellie would flank by way of distraction, using the environment of the mall to their advantage, throwing broken bottles or debris to avert attention from their maneuvers. In this, I think they would take a 2-to-1 advantage over the father-son pair, distracting Carl, who I see as a bit of a weak link in this situation.
True.
But there's also an off chance of Rick pulling his son through the mid-fight, or simply tagging Joel and Ellie with his co-python. But if he doesn't, and everyone runs out of ammo on their sidearms, the fight would lead itself into close quarters combat. Again, the aspects of positioning and distraction would remain paramount. And with Joel and Ellie's continued efforts, they'd separate the father and son, Joel taking on Rick hand-to-hand, while Ellie stalks Carl. At first, the fight between Rick and Joel would look relatively even, but eventually, I believe Rick would take the upper hand, simply younger, equally brutal, and more skilled than Joel, even if marginally. That said, I do not think this advantage over Joel would earn him a victory fast enough.
No.
Between Ellie and Carl, I favor Ellie, either by way of her surprising Carl, or even in a straight-up bout. In either case, it would free up Ellie's attention, enabling her to assist Joel, and by way of a stab to the back, or shot to the kidney, if any of her ammo remains, Ellie would defeat Rick. In this, I believe the late fight would go 3-to-1 for Joel and Ellie, mostly on the back of Ellie double-teaming on Rick, bringing Joel and Ellie's overall advantage to 6 out of 10. Of all the scenarios, I believe this matchup would end in the late fight as previously described. The matchup would likely end with Carl out of the equation, whether it was in the mid or late fight. Then it would be a Joel and Ellie tag team against Rick. And while I do believe as individuals, Rick would take Joel, I do think Ellie would tip the scales to her team's favor. And thus, if I were a betting man, I would place my wagers on Joel and Ellie as the ultimate survivors.
We want a rematch.
Of course, this is all my opinion based on my interpretation of the Walking Dead TV series and the Last of Us video game. Do you agree that Joel and Ellie would succeed? Or do you believe that the father and the son are more likely the victors? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, peace, love, and brains. Aang was noted for his mastery of the elements, while Sora was esteemed for his melee combat. I was interested to see how two of the top Dark Lords of the respective universes would work off each other.
You're not gonna shoot me. I don't think you've ever killed a man before.
Alright, let's see what the next fight is. Mako. Oh my god, is this what I think it is? Yes, it is! It's Bolin! Mako versus Bolin. You can check out Mako versus Zuko on his channel. Oh, I can't wait for that one. I voted for Mako to face Bolin, because that would be interesting. So, yes, guys, let me know down in the comments below. What did you think of this fight? Did you think that Rick and Carl were going to win? Or do you agree that Joel and Ellie would come out on top? And I will be doing more reactions of this. And stay tuned soon for maybe I will react to one of my favorite fights of Antoine's. So, yes, please like, comment, and subscribe. And until then, this is Richard Cora Kenobi saying, may the Force be with you. Later, guys.